What if I told you the sound that defined Africa for decades was not the sound of growth, but the sound of escape? The waves of the Mediterranean, crashing against fragile boats, carrying young men and women who believed their only chance at survival was to leave their homeland behind. Not because Africa was poor, but because its wealth was never allowed to stay. Today, that sound is fading, and in its place, something new is rising. In the heart of Ouagadougou, the air is no longer filled with silence or sorrow, but with the thunder of machines, the roar of industry, the steady rhythm of a nation trying to rebuild itself from the ground up. My dear brothers and sisters across Africa, wherever you are in this world, I greet you with respect, and I ask you to remember one thing. A nation only rises when its people stand together. Because what is happening right now in Burkina Faso is not just politics. It is not just economics. It is a moment of decision. A moment where one man, Ibrahim Traoré, signed a decree that may redefine the future of an entire continent. No more raw gold leaving the country. No more unprocessed lithium shipped abroad. No more cotton exported without value. Everything must be built at home. Now let me ask you something. What happens when a nation that has fed the world for generations suddenly decides to feed itself? What happens when the system that kept things stable is suddenly challenged? For a man like Malik, a young worker who spent years in Europe doing back-breaking labor just to survive, this decision meant something very simple. He is going home. Not to struggle, but to work, to build, to belong. And if one signature can bring a man home, then what could it do to the global economy? What could it do to the balance of power? And more importantly, is this the beginning of Africa's true independence? Or the start of a confrontation the world is not ready for? Stay with me, because what comes next will change the way you see Africa forever. The moment everything changed did not come with explosions, or headlines, or dramatic speeches broadcast across the world. It came quietly, a signature on a single document. But that signature carried the weight of history. When Ibrahim Traoré signed the decree banning the export of raw materials, he was not just changing a policy. He was breaking a system that had defined Africa's place in the world for generations. Gold, lithium, cotton, for decades. These resources left the soil of Burkina Faso in their rawest form. Cheap, unprocessed, undervalued. They traveled thousands of miles to factories in Europe, in America, where they were refined, transformed, and sold back to the world at prices that multiplied their value 10, sometimes 100 times over. And the people who lived on that land, they remained poor. Now ask yourself this, and be honest. How can a country rich in resources remain trapped in poverty? Because the value was never allowed to stay. That is what this decree changes. From this moment forward, nothing leaves Burkina Faso without transformation. Every ounce of gold must be refined. Every gram of lithium must be processed into battery-grade material. Every fiber of cotton must be turned into finished goods. Not somewhere else, but at home, by Burkinabe hands, by Burkinabe workers. And that shift, that single decision, is already changing lives in ways the world did not expect. Take Malik, a young man who spent 5 long years in southern Europe, working under the hot sun in agricultural fields, sending small amounts of money back home, just enough to keep his family going. He did not leave because he wanted to. He left because he had no choice. Because in a country sitting on valuable minerals, there were no jobs tied to that wealth. Now imagine the moment everything changed. A message, a contract, a job offer from a lithium processing plant built just outside his hometown. Not in Italy, not in France, but at home. Malik packed his bags, not to run away again, but to return, to build something, to finally belong to the future of his own country. Now let me ask you, what does it mean when a policy brings people back home instead of pushing them away? What does it mean when a nation starts creating value instead of exporting it? Because this is where the story becomes bigger than one man or one country. This decree is not just about economics, it is about control. For decades, the global supply chain operated on a simple equation. Africa provides the raw materials, the West provides the processing, and the profits stay in the West. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was deeply unequal. Because the moment a country depends on others to process its resources, it loses control over its own destiny. That is the system Ibrahim Traoré just challenged. And he did it knowing the risks. Because when you disrupt a system that powerful, the system does not stay quiet. It reacts, it pressures, it pushes back. And that is exactly what is coming next. But before we go there, I want you to think about one thing. If Burkina Faso succeeds, if this model works, if a nation can truly build wealth from its own soil, then what excuse remains for the rest of the world? And more importantly, who benefits from keeping things the way they were? Stay with me, because the reaction to this decision is where the real story begins. The reaction came faster than anyone expected. Not weeks, not months, but almost immediately. Because when a small nation makes a decision that threatens a global system, the system notices. In the streets of Ouagadougou, people gathered in large numbers, not in fear, but in celebration. They called it something powerful, something deeply emotional. A second independence. For the first time in generations, many believed that the wealth beneath their feet would finally belong to them. But thousands of miles away, the mood was very different. In the boardrooms of Paris, in the financial centers of London, in the policy halls of Brussels, there was no celebration. There was panic, because the reality hit quickly. European industries, already strained by global instability, depend heavily on African raw materials, lithium for electric vehicle batteries, gold for financial reserves, cotton for manufacturing. And suddenly, one of those supply lines was cut. Executives began asking the same question. What happens if this spreads? Because this was never just about Burkina Faso. This was about a precedent, and precedents are dangerous. Within days, the pressure began. Western diplomats issued warnings, carefully worded, but unmistakably clear. If Burkina Faso did not resume raw exports, there would be consequences. Economic isolation, suspension of aid, restrictions in international markets, even legal pressure through global institutions. The message was simple: return to the system, or face the cost of leaving it. Now here is where the story changes, because this is the moment many expected hesitation, negotiation, compromise. But that is not what happened. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, calm, controlled, and completely unmoved. And he said something that echoed far beyond his country's borders. The world needs our resources, but we do not need their exploitation. That was not just a statement. It was a line drawn, a line that said, we understand the system, and we are choosing to step outside of it. Now think about that for a moment, because for decades, the balance of power depended on one assumption: that African nations needed Western markets more than Western markets needed African resources. But what if that assumption is no longer true? What if the equation has changed? Because behind that calm response, there was something even more important: preparation. This was not a sudden move. This was planned. While the world was watching headlines, Burkina Faso was building quietly. New refineries, new industrial zones, new partnerships beyond traditional Western allies, markets in Asia, connections in the Middle East, alternative routes alternative buyers, alternative futures. So when the threats came, they did not land the way they were expected to. The factories did not shut down. The workers did not go home. The system did not collapse. Instead, it kept moving. And that is what made this moment so dangerous. Because for the first time, a country did not just challenge the system, it showed that survival outside of it might actually be possible. Now let me ask you something. What happens when fear stops working? What happens when pressure no longer creates compliance? Because that is when the real shift begins. Not when a law is passed, but when people realize they are no longer afraid of the consequences. And that realization is spreading quietly, but steadily, from Burkina Faso to its neighbors, to other nations watching closely. Because if one country can do this, why not another? And that is the question keeping policymakers awake at night. But while governments calculate risks and strategies, on the ground, the impact is already real. Lives are changing. Communities are shifting. And a deeper transformation is beginning to take shape. But at what cost? And how far can this go before the pressure becomes something more than economic? Stay with me, because what is happening inside the country may be even more powerful than the reaction from outside. While the world focused on geopolitics, sanctions, and supply chains, something quieter, but far more powerful, was happening inside Burkina Faso. A transformation, not in headlines, but in people's lives. Let me tell you about a man named Sadu. For over 40 years, he worked as a miner. Every day, he went into the earth, pulled out rock, dust, fragments of gold hidden inside soil that did not belong to him. And every day, he watched trucks arrive. Foreign trucks. They carried that raw earth away, to places he would never see, to be turned into something valuable, somewhere else. He never saw the final product. He never touched the wealth he helped create. Until one day, that changed. Sadu was invited to the opening of a new refinery, not owned by a foreign corporation, not stamped with a foreign logo, but built on Burkinabe soil, by Burkinabe hands. And there, in front of him, a government official placed something heavy into his palms. A bar of pure gold, refined, polished, stamped, not with a multinational brand, but with the seal of his own country. For the first time in his life, Sadu was not just a laborer. He was part of a nation building its own wealth. And that moment, that single moment, tells you everything about what is really changing here. Because this is not just about economics. It is about dignity. It is about ownership. It is about rewriting the relationship between a people and their resources. Across the country, similar stories are unfolding. Factories are running day and night. Young engineers, many of whom once believed they had to leave to succeed, are now stepping into control rooms, managing systems, operating machinery that defines the future of their nation. Universities are shifting. Students are no longer preparing for low-level administrative jobs tied to foreign companies. They are studying metallurgy, chemical engineering, industrial systems. They are preparing not to serve the system, but to lead it. Markets are changing too. For years, local markets were filled with imported goods, sold at high prices, while the raw materials used to create those goods left the country for almost nothing. Now, something different is happening. Products made inside Burkina Faso are appearing on shelves. Clothing from local cotton, materials from local processing, value, staying within the borders. And when a citizen buys something made by their own country, it does something deeper than economics. It changes how they see themselves. It replaces dependency with pride. But let's be clear, this path is not easy, because with every step toward independence, the pressure increases. Economic pressure, political pressure, and sometimes something even more dangerous: instability. Because when a system begins to lose control, it does not simply step aside. There are risks, supply disruptions, financial isolation, attempts to discredit, to destabilize, to create doubt. And the people of Burkina Faso know this. They are not naive. They understand that this transformation comes with a cost. But here is the difference. For the first time, many believe that the cost of change is less than the cost of staying the same. Because the old system was not stable. It was just familiar. And familiarity can be mistaken for safety. Now, let me ask you something. What happens when an entire population begins to believe in its own capacity? What happens when the idea of "we cannot" is replaced with "we already are"? Because that is where the real power lies. Not in policies, not in speeches, but in mindset. And that mindset is beginning to spread. From workers to students, from cities to rural villages, a quiet confidence is growing. But here is the question no one can ignore. Can this internal transformation survive the external pressure? Can a nation rebuild itself while the world around it pushes back harder and harder? Or will the weight of that pressure become too much to carry? Stay with me, because when we look beyond Burkina Faso, what we see next may change not just one country, but the entire balance of power in the world. Now, step back for a moment. Look beyond the borders of Burkina Faso and ask a bigger question. Why is the world watching this so closely? Because what is happening here does not stay here. In Washington, policymakers are not just observing a small African nation making economic changes. They are watching a potential shift in the global balance of power. Because for decades, stability in the international system has depended on predictable supply chains. Resources flow one way, value flows another. And that system has supported industries, jobs, and economic planning across the United States, from manufacturing to technology to energy. Now imagine that system starting to change. If countries like Burkina Faso, along with neighbors such as Mali and Niger, begin to process their own resources, then the cost of those resources will change. Access will change. Control will change. And when control changes, everything changes. This is not just about gold or lithium. It is about leverage. Because the country that controls processing controls pricing. The country that controls pricing influences markets. And the country that influences markets shapes global strategy. That is why this moment matters to the United States. Not as a threat, but as a signal. A signal that the world is becoming more multipolar, more independent, less predictable. And for older generations in America, those who remember how quickly global shifts can affect daily life, this raises real concerns. Will supply chains remain stable? Will prices rise? Will new alliances form outside traditional partnerships? Because here is the reality. Burkina Faso is not acting alone. There is a growing alignment in the Sahel, a shared idea that sovereignty means more than borders. It means economic control. And beyond Africa, other regions are watching. Countries in Latin America, nations in Southeast Asia, all asking the same quiet question. If they can do it, why can't we? And that is where this becomes something bigger than policy. It becomes a model that could spread. Now let me ask you something. If multiple resource-rich nations decide to follow this path, if they begin to coordinate, to trade differently, to prioritize internal value over external demand, then who will control the future of global resources? And more importantly, where does that leave the United States? Stay with me, because the answer to that question may define the next chapter of global history. So here we are, at a moment that may look small on the surface, but could reshape everything beneath it. What Ibrahim Traoré has done is not just about banning raw exports. It is not just about factories, or gold, or lithium. It is about a nation making a decision to stop asking for permission. And history has shown us something very clearly. When a nation takes that step, The road ahead is never easy, because power does not disappear quietly. It resists, it adapts, and sometimes it pushes back harder than anyone expects. The pressure on Burkina Faso will likely grow. Economic pressure, political pressure, and possibly pressures we cannot yet see. There may be attempts to isolate it, to weaken it, to prove that this path cannot work, because if it does work, then the implications are too big to ignore. It would mean that the old model, the one where resources leave and value never returns, is no longer inevitable. It would mean that sovereignty is not just a word, but a strategy. And that idea is powerful, but also dangerous, because ideas like that do not stay contained. They spread from one country to another, from one region to the next, until the question is no longer, can this happen? But how far will it go? Now let me ask you something. Is Ibrahim Traoré leading his country toward a future of strength or into a confrontation that could test its limits? Is this the beginning of Africa's true economic independence, or the opening chapter of a much larger global conflict? For those watching from the United States, for those who care about stability, security, and the future of global order, this is not a distant story. It is a signal that the world is changing faster than most people realize. And sometimes, change does not begin with a war or an election or a global crisis. Sometimes, it begins with a single decision, a single signature, and the courage to stand by it. If this story made you pause, if it made you question what you thought you knew about Africa, about power, about the world, then hold on to that thought, because the next chapter is still being written. And whether we realize it or not, we are all part of it.